Record. Alrighty, so good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Women's History Day event, The Wonderful Woman Behind Oz. My name is Rachel Christone. I'm the Director of Education here at the Salem Witch Museum.
And I'm Jill Christensen. I'm the Assistant Education Director.
So with the premiere of Wicked this past year, there has definitely been a renewed buzz surrounding our favorite fictional world, the Land of Oz. Created by author L. Frank Baum in the late 19th century, The Wizard of Oz has certainly become a cherished classic and is now generally regarded as America's first fairy tale. So though most are familiar with the characters who inhabit Oz, few are aware of their far-reaching influence. Baum's witches, in particular, both good and bad, have left strong impressions on our popular imagination. Though we will never know what precisely influenced L. Frank Baum to add good witches into his Land of Oz, it's interesting to consider a close personal connection, his mother-in-law, Matilda Joslyn Gage. A trailblazing human rights activist with a love of history, Gage was an important member of the early feminist movement. So in this presentation, we will discuss the amazing life and work of Matilda Joslyn Gage, her relationship with L. Frank Baum, and how Baum's children's story forever altered our perception of the witch. Now, just a couple of housekeeping announcements before we get started. We are recording this session, and the recording will be made available on our website on our virtual program archive, as are all of our free virtual events, which are most of our virtual events. The presentation will last for about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for a Q&A at the end. And we will be turning off our camera just so you can see the full PowerPoint, and then we will turn it back on at the end of the presentation. So without further ado,
we're off to see the wizard.
We're off to see the wizard. If only the PowerPoint will go. There we go.
Prior to delving into the Land of Oz, we need to orient ourselves in the history of witchcraft. Today, witches are frequently depicted as both good and bad, the heroes perhaps even more often than the villains. Movies, television shows, novels, and comic books often feature a good witch as the protagonist. Witches are more often than not depicted as beautiful, kind, intelligent, and aspirational figures. Here are just a few of the many pop culture witches of today. We're sure you can think of others as well. Though good witches are common in our day and age, this is quite a new interpretation of this age-old figure. A witch was first defined as an ordinary person who sold their soul to the devil in exchange for supernatural powers. This was a crime anyone could be accused of committing, man, woman, or child. These individuals were believed to be tricked, seduced, or tempted into joining Satan's hellish army, wielding diseases, storms, and misfortune against those who they wished to harm. This was a very frightening and real part of the lives of early modern men and women. Witchcraft was considered a serious criminal offense, one which could result in death for those unlucky enough to attract suspicion. While there have long been stories of beautiful enchantresses or benevolent magical women, witches were never positive figures. As they were first defined by their relationship to Satan, they were understood to be evil, sinister creatures who could be lurking or hiding anywhere. Here we can see examples of how witches were envisioned during this time.
Witch trials began in Europe around 1400 and continued until around 1750. Though the exact number of deaths is unknown, historians estimate approximately 50,000 innocent people were executed in Europe and its colonies. An accusation would typically follow a bout of unexplainable misfortune. For example, a sudden illness, stroke of bad luck, or the strange behavior of livestock. Of the tens of thousands executed for the crime of witchcraft during this period, all were innocent. There's no reason to believe these individuals were actually trying to sell their souls to the devil or harness evil forces. Instead, when we look at the records of the European witch trials, we see a classic example of scapegoating. Most often, the victims of witch trials were those who didn't quite fit into society. The poor, beggars, widows living alone, women who were argumentative or assertive, or individuals who had done something socially transgressive were most often named when witchcraft suspicions arose. For this reason, women were targeted at a very high rate. If we look at the broad span of the witch trials period, in most panics, women made up about 75% of the accused. Due to a combination of factors, including the dawn of the scientific revolution and the age of enlightenment, witchcraft was finally decriminalized throughout Europe by the mid to late 18th century. But the memory of the crime lingered on after legal witch hunts came to an end. As the witch entered the realm of folklore and fairy tales, many elements of the tragic history remained. For this reason, witches were often depicted as women in fiction and visual culture. Though occasionally portrayed as an attractive young lady, more often than not, they appeared as older, haggard matrons. Of course, some of the most famous examples can be found in the stories collected by the Brothers Grimm. In these folk legends, witches were ugly old women living in secluded places trying to ensnare young, innocent children. And this is, of course, still true for witches portrayed during Halloween today. Stereotypical witches remain cast as ugly old women with pointed noses and warts, a broomstick, pointed hat, and a black cat in tow.
The image of the witch, however, changed forever in America in the late 19th century. During this period, so many years after the frightening memory of the crime of witchcraft had faded, there was a shift towards depicting witches as beautiful, attractive young women in popular culture. As previously stated, this was not an entirely new phenomenon, as witches had sometimes been portrayed as seductresses in years past. We can see some images from visual culture of the late 19th and early 20th centuries here, with witches increasingly depicted as young and beautiful. But the core character of the witch altered most dramatically in American popular culture in 1900 with the publication of L. Frank Baum's children's story, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. This story followed Dorothy Gale, a young girl from Kansas who was swept away by a twister, landing in the colorful world of Oz. As she attempted to find her way back home, she encountered many fantastical creatures, including a scarecrow, tin man, and cowardly lion, as well as powerful witches who were both good and evil. The novel was an instant success, selling out its first edition of 10,000 copies in just 2 weeks. The first of 14 books set in the land of Oz, Baum's stories became exceedingly popular among young audiences and went on to inspire cartoons, a silent film, a wildly successful play, and of course, the 1939 film adaptation. From this point onward, Good Witches would become a cultural sensation, appearing in film, television, and comic books throughout the 20th century. But what, we might ask, inspired Baum's Good Witches?
Lyman Frank Baum was born on May 15, 1856, in Chettanango, New York. Though from a fairly affluent family, Baum struggled for many years to maintain a stable career. At various times, he tried his hand as an actor, a playwright, a poultry expert, a purveyor of Axle lubricant, store manager, newspaper editor, reporter, and traveling salesman, before finally finding his true calling as an author at the age of 41. Frank, as he was known, loved stories from a young age. As a grown man, he recalled, "I can remember my eyes have always grown big at tales of the marvelous." As brothers Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm first published their collection of oral folk stories in the 1810s, cheap English translations of the Grimm's tales were readily available and exceedingly popular in America during Baum's youth. Despite his interest in these fantastical tales, biographer Rebecca Longcrane observes, Baum's later deep anxiety about the role of fear in children's stories were ignited by his early exposure to the frightening tales of Grimm and Andersen. At the age of 25, Frank Baum met Maud Gage at a New Year's Day party. Family legend fondly recalls their first meeting. Upon arriving at the party, Baum's Aunt Josephine quickly introduced them, saying, "Frank, I want you to know Maud Gage. I'm sure you will love her." To which Frank responded, "Consider yourself loved, Miss Gage." Maud reached out her hand and said, "Thank you, Mr. Baum. That's a promise. Please see you stick to it." Maud Gage was the youngest of the family's 4 children. An outspoken, educated young woman, her upbringing had been very different from her future husband. She was among the first women accepted to Cornell University and had grown up with parents who championed the abolitionist and women's rights movements. Evidently, Maud's mother, Matilda Joslyn Gage, was not initially enthusiastic about her daughter's suitor. At the time, Baum was managing a string of opera houses owned by his father. He had also taken charge of a touring theatrical company and often appeared as an actor.
According to Maud and Frank's oldest son, Matilda was displeased when she heard news of their engagement. Evidently, Matilda told Maud, "I won't have my daughter be a darned fool and marry an actor." Maud replied, "This was goodbye then." When Matilda asked her to explain, she said, "Well, you just told me I would be a darned fool to marry an actor, and you wouldn't have a daughter of yours do that. I'm going to marry Frank, so naturally you don't want a darned fool around the house." At her words, her mother laughed, telling her they could marry in the family home. Despite her early reservations, a fond relationship soon developed between Frank and his new mother-in-law. In the words of Baum's biographer, Baum had grown up in an ambitious atmosphere of business, investment, and negotiation, oil prospecting, and medicine, and his mother's staunch Methodism. The Gages opened his mind in new ways and took him in intellectual and spiritual directions he couldn't have imagined. She goes on to say, unknown to Baum, he had found in Matilda Joslyn Gage a vital ally and a fairy godmother of sorts. Matilda Electa Joslyn was born in Cicero, New York on March 24, 1826. The daughter of Hezekiah and Helen Leslie Joslyn, her upbringing was unusual for a girl of her time. Matilda's father, the only doctor in the area, taught his daughter about anatomy and medicine from a young age, even allowing her to observe and sometimes assist him as he worked. As a young woman, Matilda hoped to become a doctor, but was denied entrance to medical school despite her excellent grades. Her mother was a lover of history and taught her daughter to appreciate research. Matilda was strongly shaped by the morals of her parents, both of whom were abolitionists. She was often privy to long conversations between her parents and their abolitionist friends, hearing them talk extensively about controversial ideas, from the banning of slavery and granting women equal rights to outlawing alcohol. The Joslyns believed in the rights of women and children and felt all beliefs should be based on science, logic, and reason. From an early age, Matilda was a passionate advocate for human rights. As a child, she joined the anti-slavery campaign, knocking on doors with petitions for the abolitionist cause. Her family home in central New York was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and as a little girl, Matilda witnessed enslaved women and men smuggled in and out of her house. Though New York outlawed slavery the year after her birth, slave catchers continued to hunt escapees throughout her childhood. As a grown woman, Matilda and her husband followed the example of her parents and opened their home as a stop on the Underground Railroad. As an adult, Matilda recalled, "I have been frequently asked what first turned my thoughts towards women's rights. I think I was born with a hatred of oppression, and two, in my father's house, I was trained in the anti-slavery ranks."
It would take almost exactly a century after Matilda's birth for women to earn the right to vote. During her lifetime, women were generally seen as inferior. Even educated, wealthy women had few choices in adulthood. They were barred from colleges, universities, and most professions. Though marriage was expected for respectable women, a married woman could not own property, sign contracts, and all that she earned or inherited belonged to her husband. Husbands had a legal right to rape or beat their wives as long as they did not inflict permanent or life-threatening damage. A woman had no legal rights to her child. If a marriage ended, the husband was the rightful guardian in every case, even in the cases of domestic violence or severe alcoholism. Despite the fact that women were prohibited from voting, serving on juries, and testifying in court, they were still taxed as any other citizen. Matilda, whose grandfather was a participant in the American Revolution, would reference this contradiction again and again in her activism, often reminding audiences that taxation without representation was the very antithesis of their country's founding. On January 6, 1845, Matilda Joslyn married Henry H. Gage, a dry goods merchant. The couple settled in Fayetteville, New York. Matilda was 18 years old at the time of their wedding and soon began a family. The Gages had 5 children over the course of their marriage, 4 of whom lived to adulthood. Though a young mother with a growing family, Gage continued to support her many social causes and soon became involved in the women's suffrage movement.
Her first speaking event was the 1852 Third National Women's Convention held in Syracuse, New York, which was attended by 2,000 people. At 26 years old, Matilda told the large audience, "While so much is said of the inferior intellect of women, it is by a strange absurdity conceded that very many eminent men owe their station in life to their mothers." In a characteristic position she would adopt throughout her career, rather than focusing on what women might hope to accomplish should they be granted equal rights, she emphasized examples of women's leadership and achievement despite their subjugation, citing examples like Sappho, the Greek poet, Queen Victoria of England, and author Harriet Beecher Stowe. In this earliest of her speeches, she boldly declared, "Although our country makes great professions in regard to general liberty, the right to particular liberty, natural equality, and personal independence of 2 great portions of this country is treated from custom with great contempt. Color in the one instance and sex in the other are brought as reasons why they should be so derided, and the mere mention of such natural rights is frowned upon as tending to promote sedition and anarchy."
After this speech, she became more involved in the movement and soon became friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Though still raising a family, Matilda was constantly working, giving speeches, writing articles for newspapers, and gathering signatures for petitions. In 1869, she helped to found the New York State Women's Suffrage Association, serving as their president for the next 9 years, and co-founded the National Women's Suffrage Association with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. She participated in a number of notable activism stunts over the course of her career. In one such example, she first attempted to vote in July of 1871 in Fayetteville, New York. She was prepared with 9 other women to make their case. First, she alone attempted to cast her vote, and she was refused on the ground she was a married woman. She then returned with 2 single women who supported themselves and owned their own home, and they too were refused. She then brought with her war widows whose husbands had died in defense of their country, and they were refused as well. She was told that the vote was for taxpayers only, to which she replied, "In Fayetteville, there was a woman who paid the most and another who paid the least amount of taxes of the populace." Though she was denied the right to vote on this occasion, she never gave up the cause.
Given that in our own time we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, it seems appropriate to briefly share an anecdote about Matilda Joslyn Gage's involvement in America's centennial. Philadelphia was chosen as the site of the official national celebration of the country's 100th birthday. And it was here Gage, Anthony, and several of their associates gathered to deliver a copy of the Women's Declaration of Rights and Articles of Impeachment against the government of the United States. This document decried the fact that women were still prohibited from voting, were prohibited from being tried by a jury of their peers, and were subjected to taxation without representation. It praised the achievements of their country over the last century, but mourned, "We cannot forget, even in this glad hour, that while all men of every race and clime and condition have been invested with the full rights of citizenship under our hospitable flag, all women shall still suffer the degradation of disenfranchisement." The document, co-authored by Gage and Stanton, was banned from the celebration by the president of the Centennial Commission. At the conclusion of a reading of the Declaration of Independence, Gage and her associates stood and strode towards the platform. Anthony presented the vice president with their declaration as her associates scattered printed copies throughout the crowd. The group then walked to Philadelphia's First Unitarian Church for the centennial meeting of the National Women's Suffrage Association. Matilda addressed the crowd, speaking in particular on the issue of habeas corpus, or the right of United States citizens to have their detention justified before the court prior to imprisonment. This was a right that was often suspended in Matilda's day in the case of married women, as their husbands could have them detained or thrown into an asylum without just legal grounds. Stanton would later recall, their work was not for themselves alone, nor for the present generation, but for all women of all time. The hopes of posterity were in their hands, and they determined to place on record for the daughters of 1976 that their mothers of 1876 had asserted their equality of rights and impeached the government of that day for its injustice towards women.
In the words of noted activist Gloria Steinem, Matilda Joslyn Gage was the woman who was ahead of the women who were ahead of their time. She believed women should have the right to divorce and spoke often about the endurance of domestic abuse. She believed in reproductive rights, arguing that a woman's body was a holy temple for its divine human use, of which she alone should have control. She believed marriage should be a partnership of two people based in love, and the control of women in marriage to be a huge element of their continued subjugation. She believed classism was as oppressive as sexism and was frustrated by educated women who participated in the oppression of their own. Unlike many others in the movement who highlighted women's morality as a reason for their right to suffrage, Gage believed women should have rights because they are equal human beings. She was disturbed by the racist rhetoric of many of her colleagues, including Anthony and Stanton. There can be seen one of the key differences that would gradually separate her from the others within the early feminist movement. Though Matilda believed in the right to vote for all, others would not go so far. Stanton, for example, was concerned about what she called, quote unquote, the lower orders, natives and foreigners, Dutch, Irish, Chinese, and African, making laws for educated women. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Matilda was also a vocal advocate for indigenous rights, criticizing the United States government for failing to respect treaties and their continually brutal treatment of indigenous people. She was honorarily adopted into the Wolf clan of the Mohawk Nation. Her differences eventually led her to break with her colleagues, many of whom believed her more radical beliefs were damaging to the movement.
Gage believed that a powerful tool for furthering the cause of women was to highlight women's accomplishments in history. In 1870, she wrote Woman as Inventor, which controversially credited Catherine Littlefield Greene as the inventor of the cotton gin. Among her many literary projects was the 3-volume series History of Suffrage, written by herself, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The project took a full decade to complete and remains an essential resource on the early history of the movement. In the words of historian Lisa Tetrault, Stanton, Anthony, and Gage were the architects of social history well before that field existed. They insisted that the deeds of women, not just military generals and statesmen, were critical places of national life. They argued that women, even obscure, ordinary women, could and did change the course of history. With the history of women's suffrage finally completed, Matilda turned her attention to another historical project. While living with her daughter Maud and son-in-law L. Frank Baum, she began Women, Church, and State. Gage later called this her chief life work and the culmination of her lifelong investigation into the wrongs done to women. The purpose of this book was to show the long subjugation of women under the rule of the church and to inspire women to take an interest in the study of history. She had begun formulating these beliefs long before, feeling that it was not just laws, but also the state and church that continued women's oppression. This book forcefully vocalized one of her most radical positions, one which further alienated her from the mainstream feminist movement. The 500-page completed volume traced a wide range of history described by one author as part history, part anthropology, part manifesto. In the preface to this work, she plainly stated, "Read it, examine for yourselves. Accept or reject from the proof offered, but do not allow the church or the state to govern your thoughts or your judgment.
The book systematically covered a huge span of history, from women's roles in ancient societies to the discrimination of women in canon law and doctrine of original sin. She discussed the abuse of women in the feudal system and legal subjugation of wives in history and the modern day. According to the Matilda Joslyn Gage Center, quote, this classic history of women's oppression is one of the first attempts to document the sad legacy of injustice and discrimination against women, which is unfortunately inseparable with the history of both Christianity and the evolution of the Western state. Gage also drew on her connection to local indigenous tribes in upstate New York, the Six Nations of the Iroquois. She described the nearly equal division of power between the sexes in this republic, citing how the Iroquois clan allowed mothers to choose their chiefs, possessed veto power on questions of war, and allowed women to both own property and manage the agriculture of the tribe. She reminded her readers the persecution of women continued in their own time, when men could still beat, imprison, or even kill their wives with little legal recourse. In her concluding words, she proclaimed, the woman who possesses love for her sex, for the world, for truth, justice, and right, will not hesitate to place herself upon record as opposed to falsehood, no matter under what guise of age or holiness it appears.
Though radical in its arguments, the book was initially received well, garnering positive ratings from the Philadelphia Press, Chicago Times, Boston Transcript, and Kansas Farmer. Russian author Leo Tolstoy even sent an appreciative letter to Gage saying, it proved a woman could think logically. However, it would eventually draw the attention of Anthony Comstock, the secretary for the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, who had put forward the act banning the transportation and circulation of obscene materials. He publicly called the book unfit to read and declared he would prosecute any school board that allowed it in their library. When interviewed about the controversy, Matilda informed a reporter, I look upon Anthony Comstock as a man who is mentally and morally unbalanced, not knowing right from wrong or the facts of history from tales of lust. Notably, in what has been described by one historian as Matilda's most important and controversial chapter, she described witches as innocent women, a radical argument for the 19th century. She argued certain kinds of women were particularly vulnerable to witchcraft accusations, such as women who were independent, knowledgeable, old, physically disabled, or mentally ill. In her words, the crime of witchcraft never existed, save in the imagination of those persecutors, and which grew in their imagination from a false belief in woman's extraordinary wickedness based upon a false theory as to original sin. Though her argument is broad and, of course, flawed when compared with modern scholarship, she articulated many accurate details of the European witch hunt, including the tendency of witchcraft accusations to target innocent women, the impact of coerced confessions, and the fact that young children were targeted. She described the terrors of the witch trials period, referencing the infamous witch hunting manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, the hired witch finders who combed through communities looking for witches, and the gruesome methods used to kill those convicted of this imaginary crime. All was used to emphasize the church's doctrine of original sin and how the belief in women's inherent wickedness made them especially vulnerable to witchcraft accusations. Notably, in this chapter, she also included several strange stories from her own time, which she had encountered while conducting research. When writing of the historical belief in a witch's ability to influence the weather, she included the words of a prominent physician who told her a most destructive cyclone, known to the Signal Service Bureau as the Great Cyclone, was brought about by means of magical formula made use of by a schoolgirl in a spirit of ignorant bravado.
By this time, Matilda had begun to spend 6 months of every year with Maud and Frank Baum. Despite her initial reservations, Matilda and Frank had grown very close. Frank once described his mother-in-law as undoubtedly one of the most remarkable women of her age, possessed by the highest literary ability, the brightest thoughts, the clearest and most scholarly oratory, the most varied research, and intelligent and diversified pen of any public woman in the past 20 years. Women, Church, and State was published in July of 1893 and sold at $2 for the cloth volume, three for half leather bound. Baum, however, had an idea for a special edition. In a letter to her son Clarkson, Matilda wrote, "Frank is to have an unbound copy, has engaged some Frenchmen to bind it extra firm as a memorial volume with my name written, etc. He thinks that he can sell a good many also, has already had orders." It's very likely, if not certain, that Frank Baum read his mother-in-law's latest work, some of which was written in his own home, and probably discussed her research as it was underway. In fact, in the words of one biographer, Baum may have liked the idea of storm conjuring witches in particular. Though Frank Baum had tried his hand at many occupations, it was not until middle age that he began to experience success as a writer. In 1897, he wrote and published Mother Goose in Prose, which was a collection of Mother Goose rhymes. 2 years later, he partnered with illustrator W. W. Denslow to publish Father Goose, his book. This second book of nonsense poetry soon became a national success, earning recognition as the best-selling children's book of the year. According to Gage's biographer, Angelica Shirley Carpenter, it was Matilda who encouraged her creative son-in-law to write down and sell his stories. In the last years of her life, Gage wrote numerous letters to relatives articulating her pride in Baum's emerging publication success. But in early 1898, Matilda Joslyn Gage, who was at the time staying with Frank and Maud, became ill. In March, she suffered a serious stroke and died 5 days later. It was around this time that Baum began to work on a new story, set in a far-off land where a little girl was swept away by a magical cyclone. 2 months after the death of the family's matriarch, a new family member joined the extended Gage Baum clan, Matilda and Frank's niece, Dorothy. Tragically, only 5 months later, the infant passed away. Maud was again devastated by this loss, her distress enough that she required medical attention. The loss of the family's matriarch and the newest member of the extended family in only 1 year was very difficult. Some have speculated, perhaps the colorful far-off land that Baum discovered was an imaginative act of compensation, an attempt to fill the space created by loss.
In 1900, Frank Baum finally published the culmination of his last several years of work, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Not only did the book feature little Dorothy Gale, but Baum's protagonist was assisted and assailed by witches throughout the story, featuring supernaturally powerful women who were both good and evil. We will never know what precisely inspired this addition to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Perhaps Baum's witches were simply colorful characters lurking in his active imagination. Perhaps it was his childhood exposure to fairy tales and his enthusiasm to give them a modern twist. But certainly it is equally possible, if not more likely, that he was inspired by the passion of his beloved mother-in-law, a champion of women's independence and a witchcraft historian. Some have even speculated these characters were a kind of tribute to Matilda, who passed away just 2 years before the book was published. In the 14 books L. Frank Baum included in the Oz series, many included powerful good witches and supernatural women. In fact, in his second story, a magical princess named Ozma comes to power. For the remainder of the series, the land of Oz is ruled by women. And of course, with the 1939 premiere of the film adaptation of Baum's famous children's story, America was introduced to an even more obviously benevolent witch. Glinda, traveling by Bubble with her huge pink dress, wand, and crown, provided a striking contrast to the Wicked Witch, painted green for the film to both accentuate her wickedness and take advantage of the new Technicolor technology. Glinda the Good Witch, that combined characters from Baum's original story, has remained a common cultural reference in American popular culture since her debut. Over the course of the 20th century, more and more good witches joined her in the popular media. Some painted in over-the-top femininity, some more subtly beautiful. And of course, just this past November, we were introduced to yet another Glinda, or Gullinda, as she is initially known in this version of the story, in the film adaptation of Wicked. Though L. Frank Baum did not necessarily invent the Good Witch, this author introduced America to its first fairy tale, one with witches who were both wicked and helped save the day. The lasting impact of this story cannot be overstated, one which has inspired generations of little girls to see witches as both good and bad, the heroes as often or maybe even more than the villain.
There's a reason most have never heard the name Matilda Joslyn Gage. In the words of one biographer, because controversial ideas were tied so closely to Joslyn Gage, and because she would not compromise them, her concerns and her contributions were pushed to the margins of the movement activity and were omitted from or downplayed by those who write its history. The erasure seems to have begun after the merger of the National and American Women's Suffrage Associations, a move that led to a distinctively more conservative direction for the first wave feminist movement. It was in these years Gage had a distinct falling out with Stanton and Anthony. The severity of this conflict can be seen in one unhappy anecdote. When a publisher hoped to promote Women, Church, and State by highlighting Gage's connections to Stanton and Anthony, Matilda swiftly wrote to her son, "If Woman, Church, and State cannot stand on its own, let it fall. I have forbidden the publisher to mention those women in connection with me ever again. They have stabbed me in reputation, and Susan at least has stolen in money from me. They are traitors also to women's highest needs, and Mrs. Stanton especially I look upon in the women's battle for freedom, as I do on Benedict Arnold during the War of the Revolution. She is a traitor to what she knows is right." Though in recent years, more have begun to highlight the essential roles of Matilda Joslyn Gage in the early feminist movement, her name often remains conspicuously absent from popular discourse. In the 1990s, Margaret Rossiter coined the term the Matilda effect. This refers to the systemic under-recognition of women's contributions to science and other fields. It can also include attributing women's work to men or overlooking their achievements entirely. Today, we remember Matilda Joslyn Gage, a historian, human rights activist, author, mother, wife, and much more. We have truly just scratched the surface of the fascinating work and life of this trailblazing figure in this presentation. If you are interested in learning more, we highly recommend visiting the Matilda Joslyn Gage Center in Fayetteville, New York, and following them on social media. We had a couple of images that were graciously we were given permission to use by them, and they really do have some amazing resources to share. So we will turn our camera back on, and we do have one final page here of resources for further learning. Does anybody, if you have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat. Now's when we should play the Wizard of Oz. We'll give it a minute or two. I know sometimes it takes some time to type out questions, and if not, we will conclude our talk today. Thank you everyone who came. I know it's hard attending a talk on a Wednesday night.
It does take some
It was
time to
wicked
read.
amazing. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. We appreciate you coming. I hope you learned a little bit more
And it will
about.
be up in about a week's time, right?
Yes, yeah. So the recording of this will be up early next week, ideally. All right. Definitely go check out the Matilda Joslyn Gage Center. Follow them on social media. And good night, everybody. Thank you for
Thanks for
coming.
coming.
Happy Women's History Month, all.